Hi everyone, welcome to our very last pre-recorded lecture. This is lecture 5.3 and we will be talking about our last paper by Catherine Norlock on online shaming. This is going to be a fairly short lecture. So the goal of Norlock's paper is to show that we can better understand our responsibilities as potential shamers in cyberspace by understanding the role that our imaginal relationships play in online shaming. So she borrows some of this terminology from some social psychology literature, and the term imaginal relationships is going to play an important role in her account. And Norlock notes that Ronson, who we've mentioned before, he provided really good evidence that the consequences of online shaming often go much beyond what shamers imagine will happen or intend to have happen. But Norlock thinks that making this observation is not quite enough. So she wants to supplement this observation with a further point about why shamers shame and about how this impacts their responsibilities. Okay, so let's talk about the details. So let's ask the question whether or not online shaming is usually a kind of social tyranny. And in asking this question, Norlock refers to some remarks that John Stuart Mill made long ago about the tyranny of the mob. So Norlock says, well, I acknowledge that online shaming is sometimes a kind of mob crusade. So she's going to acknowledge that there is sometimes this feature to online shaming. But she actually wants to show that this is not the primary reason shamers shame, on her view. She thinks that the main intent behind online shaming is often that the shamers want to enjoy what she calls imaginal relationships with other shamers. This can mean that they want to have social recognition from other shamers. They might simply enjoy the online company of other shamers. And Norlock thinks that when we look at online shaming in this way, we'll understand some things better. We'll understand why the importance of what happens to the shamed is so much greater than the importance of what's happening for the shamer. And she also thinks that this observation she makes is supported by the fact that shamers are often relatively disinterested in both the well-being and the deserved suffering of the shamed. So they're not worried about how the shamed is doing, either in terms of their well-being or in terms of whether they're getting the suffering they deserve. So Norlock says. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about what these imaginal relationships are. So basically, to have an imaginal relationship or to engage in imaginal relationships with other people is just to identify with absent people and imagine interactions with them. This is an important aspect of all of our lives, Norlock notes. We do this all the time, and this is to engage in imaginal relationships. So here are some examples. We often imagine having conversations with our deceased relatives. We often think about how they would perceive our current choices in lives, and maybe we even imagine what kind of advice they would give us about problems that we're facing. We often might imagine how a mentor might advise us when struggling with some issue ourselves. As you're writing a talk, if you have to give a talk, you would imagine your audience and how they would perceive your talk and react to it. And I imagine your experiences when I'm preparing tests. So all of these ways of relying on imagined experiences can be good and useful to us. It helps us accomplish things we need to accomplish. Okay, so this is just a feature of human psychology and our daily lives, according to Norlock. We engage in imagined relationships all the time. But now let's ask what happens when this very ordinary capacity for having imaginal relationships is interacting with the online world in the context of online shaming. So shamers, for their part, the people doing the shaming, they become very connected with other shamers in this way. Imaginary relationships with other shamers proliferate in the online context, meaning they just multiply. And to a large extent, we can't help having our imaginal relationships proliferate in this way. This is because we care about how others online perceive us, whether we want to care about that or not. But the same does not apply to the shamed. Shamers rarely engage in imaginal relationships with the shamed. So they have tons of proliferating imaginal relationships with other shamers, whom they're imagining, perceiving in their tweets or whatever, but they rarely engage in a rich imaginal relationship with the shamed. They don't imagine themselves in conversation with the shamed. So this would be perhaps imagining the response of the shamed, which Norlock is claiming online shamers rarely really do. And she provides some empirical evidence for this. So she cites some studies which looked at what kinds of tweets people tweeted when they were engaging in online shaming. And what these studies found is that tweets often focus on one-upmanship, social rewards, so like retweets, showing off self-righteousness, and so on. And these kinds of things are things that are oriented towards other shamers, not towards the shamed. If you're worrying about these kinds of things, the reasoning goes, you're worrying about how other shamers are perceiving you, and you're not focusing primarily on the person you're shaming. Okay, so there's this, but then at the same time, being shamed has a huge significance for the person who's being shamed. And this significance goes far beyond even losing one's job. So, as a person who is being shamed, one cannot simply ignore the shame. And one reason for this is that we do not have control over all of our imaginal relationships. Here's what Norlock says. She says, "We are unable to control the extent to which intangible words in cyberspace take the form of imaginal relationships that burden or brighten our self-perceptions." So the shamed person, when receiving shame from thousands and thousands of people, has very negative imaginal relationships with all those thousands of people, and that affects their well-being, obviously. Okay, so you might hear all this and think, wait a second, I actually think online shamers are really more like a mob. Aren't they more like a mob than Norlock's account is acknowledging? So Norlock says, I know you might think that online shamers are aiming to punish. And one reason you might think this is that shamers often seem to conceive of their target as a person who has high status and who needs to be taken down a notch. So this is often part of the narrative in online shaming. Here's an example. So going back to the case of Justine Sacco, Norlock says, the perception of Sacco as having high status might suggest that the target's demise is the point of shaming after all. But I suggest that the reduction of the target's imagined high status is a necessary condition without being the purpose of the cyber gathering. The purpose, often, is for shamers to feel that they are in league with each other. There must be a high status target for the many to be in concert with each other, tilting at giants and enjoying the solidarity born of their successes. Okay, so what is she saying here? She's saying that it's true that online shamers tend to think of the shamed as deserving punishment and sanction of some sort. This is a necessary condition on people engaging in online shaming. But Norlock thinks that this still isn't to say that the main purpose of the online shaming is to punish. She thinks that shamers must think as a necessary condition on participating in shaming, that the shamed deserves punishment, deserves to be brought down. But that's not the main purpose of the cyber gathering, the shaming. The purpose is to engage in these relationships with other shamers. So that's Norlock's response to this objection. So where does this leave us? Well, if Norlock is right, then in part because of how imaginal relationships function for us, we can't help but focus on our imaginal relationships with other shamers. We don't have full control over this aspect of our psychology. But in this context, we need to be very careful because given how many other shamers there are, our concern for social recognition is going to swamp our concern for the target of the shaming. So we're just not really going to think about the person being shamed that much, given how our imaginal relationships function and the many, many, many imaginal relationships that we have with other shamers when we're engaging in online shaming. So Norlock says, if I'm right that our self-concepts are influenced by imaginal relationships that outrun our capacities to manage their effects, then philosophical contributions to the literature on online shaming could include ethical recommendations grounded in the value and import of our imaginal relations. So really, Norlock is pointing to an important feature of online shaming, an important driving generator of it, that she thinks needs to be theorized more. So she's leaving room for a lot of work to be done, but she thinks you can't really understand either why people engage in online shaming or what responsibilities they really have unless you understand the role of these kinds of imagined relationships in online shaming, both for the shamers and for the shamed. And I take it this means it's not enough to note that shamers often don't appreciate the severity of the consequences of online shaming. We also need to understand both the forces pushing us towards engaging in it and how these same forces make the consequences very severe for the person shamed, who is shamed. Okay, so that is it for our pre-recorded lectures. I just wanted to say thank you all for bearing with these unusual circumstances and being so hardworking, and overall a pleasure to teach. Even those of you whom I didn't actually see live in Zoom class, it has been a great pleasure to get a sense of who you are as students through reading your discussion posts. That really contributed to feeling like I knew you all a bit. So I hope that the end of the quarter goes well for you all, and I will see you in one more Zoom class. Okay.